Good afternoon and good morning to you all. For those of you who are joining us for this Iran session with the European Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Ellie Geranmayeh. I am the Deputy Head of ECFR's Mena program, and I'm delighted to be with you today with a very distinguished panel of analysts, experts, and countless professors, actually, other than myself, who are looking at Iran and the domestic debate that's unfolding on various issues. We are here to discuss a new extensive ECFR report on Iran that was published last week called Reviving the Revolutionaries, How Trump's Maximum Pressure is Shifting Iran's Power Balance. It's never a quiet week on Iran, and this week we had a major showdown playing out at the UN Security Council over Iran, with Secretary of State Pompeo and Foreign Minister Djavad Zarif making the case for their respective countries in the international playing field. We've also, as of today, heard quite disturbing news about certain incidents at Natanz nuclear facility in Iran, which I'm sure is going to spark further debate on the international scene about which path the international community and Iran will take regarding the nuclear issue. I want to take this moment to thank you all for joining us either in Zoom or on Facebook live stream, and a particular thanks to our expert panel group, who I'll introduce to you shortly. A quick note on the format. We are on the record, and as I mentioned, we are live streaming this event. The discussion will be more of a conversation style between myself and the panelists. However, we encourage you all to submit your questions through the Q&A functions in Zoom or through the comment section on Facebook as the discussion goes along, and the hosts of the meeting will put these questions back to the panel throughout the conversations that we're having. So please be interactive and do engage. A quick note on ECFR's new Iran paper and why we actually put it together. As we know, looking at foreign policy of many countries around the world, it's first and foremost influenced by domestic politics and domestic events. And many times when I've spoken to European officials and US officials about what path Iran may take, I always urge them to look at the internal debate and discourse that's happening in the country and shaping the decisions, particularly of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. And in the West, particularly in the media, we have very neat ways of categorizing Iran's power centers into hardliners versus reformists. And the idea behind this paper was to begin a conversation to unpack the various power centers and the subgroups within those that actually end up influencing which decisions Iran takes and how the supreme leader is influenced. Now, I have to say, when I started working on this paper, I had many warnings from people who are in Tehran or outside watching what's happening in the domestic landscape, particularly to be humble about my assessments of where things may go. Iran, under the Islamic Republic of Iran for the past 4 decades, has essentially gone from managing one crisis to the next. And various power centers and various figures that lead those power centers have been making bets and revising their responses according to the trends that they see both inside of the country and in terms of external pressures. Now, this paper tries to unpack a few things. First of all, we look at how power operates and how decisions are made in today's Iran. Secondly, we look at decision shapers, those parties who are trying to influence the ultimate decisions that come from Iran's supreme leader. And we try and put them into 3 broad categories, which we delve into each one. First one are the modernizers that are seen as integral to creating internal support for the nuclear deal. The second group go by the name of the principalists, as many people who've been looking at Iran's politics have come across. And this group has many subgroups, actually described by one of our interviews as a herd of cats that's very difficult to bring them together on a unified position. And finally, it's the so-called securocrats, which are led by powerful voices amongst Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and are gaining increasing amounts of power under the recent years of maximum pressure campaign. The next thing the paper does is try and unpack three key questions that are facing Iran's leaders today that have a direct consequence for Western foreign policy towards Iran. The first question is how to fix the economy, and indeed if the West, US, and Europe should be part or can be part of that solution. The second is whether diplomacy with Washington is a wise plan going forward, particularly in light of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. And the third question is how does Iran bring security to itself and its borders in a very turbulent region? And the final section of the paper looks at what Europe should do with this information and how it can look at Iran's discourse and the shifts that are happening to better influence and incentivize Iran into a diplomatic track. And all of this comes back to the question of the economy. Now, to help us understand some of the ideas in the paper and indeed challenge the ideas in the paper where it's merited, I hope, I wanted to now turn the conversation to our great panel that we have. And again, we'll just mention to please start feeding your questions as the conversation goes along. So first, I wanted to turn to Mohsen Milani. Mohsen, if I may, you've been watching Iran's domestic politics for a number of years, and I wanted your take on the idea explored in the paper that really we are seeing a new, very solid relationship forming between Iran's supreme leader and the so-called principalists and securocrat faction as a consequence of the pressures that Iran is feeling both internally and externally. How does this new alignment look to you, and is it durable? Over to you, Mohsen.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I read your paper, and it is a fantastic paper. Congratulations to you and to the European Committee on Foreign Relations. It is also a great honor to be on the same panel with three great scholars, serious scholars, real scholars, and good colleagues. I believe the fundamental conclusion of your paper is quite accurate. There has been a power shift, what I call a power shift in Iran, and there are a number of reasons why this power shift has taken place. A few years ago, Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, talked about the second phase of the Islamic Revolution. What he probably meant by this is not only a younger generation of Islamicists occupying important positions in Iranian power hierarchy, but also to solidify the Islamic component of the Islamic Republic of Iran. In your paper, you rightly talk about this constant friction between the Republican component and the Islamic component of Iran. I believe what we have seen in the past few years is a drastic shift toward the empowering of the Islamic component and the weakening of the Republican component. Now, the question is why? I think there are 3 or 4 major reasons. Number one, I think when the United States decided to withdraw from the Iran's nuclear deal and then imposed severe sanctions on Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei started to rethink about his overall strategy. That factor, along with the fact that the supreme leader is about 80 years old and is already concerned about the legacy of his succession, and the fact that the sanctions by the US have created serious economic and political crisis, and we have seen unrest in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, a few years ago, made a fundamental decision that I think is unique in his 30-year-old rule, and that is to consolidate his power, to homogenize the governing elite, and give absolutely no concession to his opponents. In many ways, and I'm not trying to compare Ayatollah Khamenei with President Donald Trump, but in one way, their strategy seems to be identical, and that is, as long as they can solidify their base, as long as they can keep their base intact and in power, they can much in a much better way, deal with unrest and their opponents. And that's what Ayatollah Khamenei has attempted to do. And that is why now we see the Iranian parliament in control of the conservative. This is why we also see a good chance of a conservative winning the elections in next year's presidential election. And therefore, your fundamental conclusion about the power shift in Iran is accurate. It has shifted toward the more conservative, security-oriented forces. But let me make that final point. This power shift is reversible.
Thank you very much, Mohsen, and I'm sure we'll come back to that reversibility point. Given that you talked about the fact that actually these more arch-conservative forces may in fact grab the last hold of the presidency, the last remaining post that's in the hands of the so-called modernizers, let me turn to Professor Nasser Hadian, who's joining us from Tehran. Welcome, and I very much hope your internet connection provides strong for our discussions today. Nasser, let me come to you to ask about the mood among President Rouhani's entourage and more broadly, the bigger clan of modernizers, which includes the reformists. There's a lot of conversation that I tried to capture in the paper about the fact that this sense of hopelessness that's prevailing among this camp may cause some within the modernizer group to actually retrench from the 2021 presidential elections in Iran and actually give the floor to this alignment between the principalists and securocrats to take the presidency. Do you think that this is something that really will happen in Iran? What is the mood today among the modernizers? If I may turn to you, please, Nasser.
First of all, thank you very much, Ellie, for inviting me for such an excellent panel. I read your paper, I enjoyed it, and to a large extent, I agree almost with every point which you mentioned. First of all, I fully agree with Mohsen, almost entirely agree with him, particularly his last point, the reversibility. So saying that, then let me go to my analysis. You know, among the modernizers, we can distinguish three groups, basically. One group which would call for boycott of the election. They would say the argument is basically that the principalist and particularly Ayatollah Khamenei is using the reformists to give a sort of legitimacy to the election process, which they feel deeply, is not fair, it's not free, it's not legitimate. So that's one group of the reformists. Particularly the reformists. I would divide the reformists to two major camps. One is the pragmatists, which President Rouhani basically is presiding over it. Before that, I mean, former President Rafsanjani, late Rafsanjani, used to provide the leadership. And then we have the reformists, which former President Khatami basically, I can say, somehow provide leadership. So the first group basically belong to the reformist group who would call for boycotting of the election, presidential election. And to some extent also they boycotted the previous Nages election as well. So that's the argument. We shouldn't give the legitimacy. The other group, number two group, is no, we should participate, but conditionally. In other words, if our candidates are qualified, and if we have choices, then we have our own choices, then we have to participate. So here again, most of the people who belong to this second group are also reformists, although also you can find some pragmatists in that group as well. Their argument is, you know, you should not give a blank check to Ayatollah Khamenei or to the other side. Basically, that, okay, we are going to, under any condition, we are going to participate. And then the third one is the group which would argue that, I mean, as long as we have a choice of between -8 and -10, we have to participate. So -8 certainly would be better than -10. So they are very much in deal with the real politics, and they think that, in real politics, not always the choices are between the good and the bad. Thus, the argument is we should participate. And also, I can say that basically some of the reformists and a lot of pragmatists belong to this group. So in general, I can tell you that the argument of reformists is, we have to have group in the polity. We have to have the groups in the border of polity and society, and we have to have groups in the society. They should divide the task among themselves, and depending on where you are, then your positions will be determined. If you are in the society, so you can have a more radical position, you can criticize, for instance, Ayatollah Khamenei or many other things. But if you are in a polity, you just cannot do that, because you will be expelled from the polity. So prerequisite for staying in the polity would be basically accepting the rules of the polity. And you have to seek, for instance, the group which is in the polity, like Aref, like Jahangiri, like Zangene, like many others. They would call for, to have a relatively fair, relatively competitive election. But the groups in the society, they can have a more radical positions of, no, we have to have a free, fair, unconditionally fair election. Otherwise, we are not going to participate. Thus, it all depends where you are. But in general, I can tell you that although considering the current condition, we can say that, okay, safely power have been to some extent shifted, probably in the society, not in the polity. In the polity, I guess Ayatollah Khamenei has been relatively in charge all along, at least for the last 2 decades. But in the society, we can say, yes, the mood has shifted toward more principalists, conservatives, but it all depends whom we are talking. Because if we are talking about the middle classes, I guess the middle classes still are very much supportive of the reformists, provided the reformists provide the type of leadership which they expect, and provided they call for the demands which are the demands of the middle classes. I see that, so that's why, I mean, if we have a strong reformist candidate which can be qualified, or if we have a reformist somehow, or a candidate like, for instance, Zarif, no matter how much criticism is outside Iran or inside Iran about him, but still he has the charisma, he has the legitimacy to mobilize. And I guess fairly well he can mobilize the middle classes in his support. And if reformists to me are the only one, not the pragmatists, are the only force in Iran. Of course, I'm not talking about the Revolutionary Guard. I'm talking about the civil societies, or civil societies institutions, and the political parties are the only force who have the organization and organization capability to mobilize their base. No other groups have that capability. So if the reformists decide to back Zarif, I guess he has a very good chance of defeating almost every candidate from the other side. No matter how powerful the other sides are, how much resources they have at their disposal, at the end of the day, if the reformists decide to come, and if they are able to mobilize and convince the middle classes to participate in the election, Zarif is in a good position to defeat the other candidates, no matter the other candidates are.
Thank you very much, Nasser, for dropping that bombshell into the discussion about Foreign Minister Zarif. One of the issues that we unpack in the paper is actually the progress that may be made on a diplomatic track between Iran and the international community from now till the elections in Iran, which are May or June of next year, does have a chance of actually affecting the optics and the discourse inside Iran running up to the elections. But let me slightly shift the conversation and go to Nages here. Nages, you were meant to be in London doing a book tour of an excellent book you've written, looking at the dynamics and the discourse within the IRGC. One of the findings in our paper and recommendations to European governments is that the IRGC, no matter who sits in power in the White House or as president in Iran, the IRGC is a power to be reckoned with. It's here to stay as a feature of Iran's political dynamics, and we lack a nuanced understanding of what's going on in the group. Essentially, I wanted to get your thoughts on the debate that you're seeing unfolding within the IRGC camp in the aftermath of both Qasem Soleimani's assassinations and the hit to Iran from COVID-19, about what a competent political structure should look like in the country. So would really benefit from some of your views. Thank you, Nages.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's a great pleasure to be on this excellent panel with such wonderful scholars that I've been reading for such a long time. And thank you, Ellie, for such a great paper that you wrote. It was really informative and I think did a great job in capturing a very complex environment right now. So I think one of the key things that I learned throughout my research in Iran is that the IRGC is not one camp, that within the IRGC, there are many camps and there's lots of competition. So in the lead up to the JCPOA, the signing of the JCPOA, I remember there was lots of conversation of, will the IRGC come on board or will they not come on board? And I was doing my research in Iran at the time, and it was very obvious that they would come on board to any kind of what becomes the Iran deal, especially among many segments of folks who are within the IRGC, because at the end of the day, like the political and establishment of the Islamic Republic as a whole, what is important to the IRGC is the continuation of the Islamic Republic. It is at the core also a pragmatic organization. However, within the IRGC, just like we see at other levels of Iranian government, is that there is a lot of debate and conversation and more than anything competition. So there are folks within that camp that were very much aligned from the mid-1990s with the reformists and President Khatami at the time, who when I was in Iran during the first election of Rouhani, many of them came out in support at the ballot box, voting for Rouhani because they very much disliked the types of things that Ahmadinejad had done while he was president. However, having said all of that, they are also folks who come at this with a military mindset, and what is most important to them is the defense of the nation, right? And so for them, when they saw that Trump was acting the way that he was with the rhetoric that he was bringing forward, withdraws from the JCPOA and imposes sanctions, but not just sanctions, everything else that goes into maximum pressure, I think is even more important when it comes to the Revolutionary Guard, the sabotage campaigns, the cyber warfare, the very, very heavy media and social media wars that happen from the outside into Iran to try to sway public opinion in one way or the other. These are seen as active war measures and active war that's being done on Iran. So from that perspective, even the folks who were agreeing and wanting engagement with the West and wanting to have someone like Rouhani and Zarif at the forefront, even they have retreated from that position, because now what they see is that they tried that path, and that path has led to the West, especially the United States, not wanting to deal with Iran as an independent sovereign nation. And so that has made it so that they are further entrenched now in a very defensive position. I agree with Professor Milani that the power shift is reversible, because in reality, the principalists and even the securocrats don't have popular support beyond their base, and even their base, depending on what's happening, may not agree with particular principalists or securocrats that are at the forefront. There's a lot of competition within, for example, the Revolutionary Guard. When we think of Ghalibaf, who's now going to be the Speaker of the Parliament, for example. So even within the base, there's going to be a lot of competition depending on what happens. But what I will say is that no matter what, the revolution, there are very strong components in the Revolutionary Guard who do not want to constantly be in a battle with the West, because it ends up meaning that it makes their position and positionality in Iran for a domestic audience much more difficult to contain. But having said that, at the end of the day, what they are viewing right now is what the United States is doing with Iran, but also what the US and Israel's positions in the region as a whole are taking. And I think that right now, in the past 2.5 years, their position has been an extremely defensive one because they felt under attack. And whatever happens in the US elections in the coming months, and then the positions that are taken after there, will determine a lot of what happens on the domestic sphere.
Thank you very much, Nages. And that regional picture is something I want to delve into a little bit later. But you mentioned that even some camps within the IRGC were supportive of Rouhani back in 2013. And I guess primarily that's based on his promise to improve the economy. And a big chunk of our paper is actually dedicated to looking at the discourse inside Iran over the economic issues that we've seen now over the past 2 years, not only take a major hit from US sanctions policies, but also now from plummeting oil prices and COVID-19, which I think has caused a moment of rethink within various groups about whether their positions on how to improve the economy can really be the true fix that Iran needs. Having said that, despite the shrink that is predicted for this year, around 5 to 6%, we now have the IMF and the World Bank both predicting a small but noticeable rebound in the economy. So given that the economy is going to take a lot of the focus of any future negotiations with Iran as well, let me go to Professor Salehi-Isfahani, who is at least my guru for anything to do with what's going on the ground in Iran's economy and the future landscape of Iran. Djavad, how do you see the different camps and voices of power inside the Islamic Republic of Iran today offer solutions for how to address these economic needs, particularly given the hit to the oil prices and COVID-19? Is sanctions lifting viewed as a solution for many people, even among the modernizers? Is there a debate about how effective sanctions easing from the US side can be given the current world economic outlook that we have? Over to you, Djavad. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Well, you're very kind. Let me also congratulate you on writing an excellent paper, which is very nuanced, and I think very timely, to help your audience in Europe and the United States understand a little bit better Iran. I don't think that understanding is there. And Narges's comments are very much to the point that we don't even understand the composition of the IRGC, and she's done an excellent job in helping us learn that. Your paper does a very good job of describing the revolution as having multiple goals. It was a developmental initiative. The revolutions wanted to make the lives of ordinary Iranians better. They also wanted to bring independence, which reads as anti-imperialism and anti-US, anti-Israel at times. And ever since then, for the last 4 decades, they've been trying to find a balance between these two goals that are not mutual. They sometimes are contradictory. If you want to get good development, you have to play North Korea. You have to work with the US, say nothing critical about what happened in the past, and export, export, export. Or if you want to be revolutionary, you like sanctions because it cuts off the fifth column, which is something Iranians are very, very concerned about. Iranians inside Iran that like the West more than Iran itself. And if I were going to make one modification on this modernizer group, which I very much like, I think that the classification you make is very informative. There are two kinds of modernizers. There are modernizers I would call stayers. They like to live in Iran. They don't see their children growing up in Europe and the United States. And there are the runaways. And because at the revolution, the whole elite of Iran escaped, people became very concerned about whose children have green cards. And that has been a serious concern inside Iran. Who is running Iran, who has dual citizenship, who has green card. The reason why they're afraid is that in any deal like JCPOA, they're afraid that they are really making it easy for them and their children to leave Iran, as opposed to making JCPOA work for ordinary Iranians, the majority of Iranians who live in small towns, who are living below $10, $12 a day. They are middle class in many ways, thanks to public services that have become available in the last 40 years, electricity, family planning, and so on. But they're still looking at the global economy with trepidation. They see a good side of it. I think a lot of the elite in all the camps, modernizers, conservatives, and even IRGC, they recognize no country can develop with complete autarky. And they have their own hierarchy of what they need from any future JCPOA or JCPOA 2, version 2. I want to hasten to add that there is, as you point out very well, there's no push button to go back to JCPOA after election, even if Biden wins. There's going to be a debate inside Iran. JCPOA was disliked by a very significant group of Iranians. And the reason why they disliked it became very clear as soon as the JCPOA was signed. The Minister of Transportation started announcing buying 200 airplanes, as if most Iranians were waiting to go to Europe in clean airplanes, as opposed to talking about jobs. When JCPOA was signed, Iranians had had an experience of a big oil boom that improved their kitchens, improved their living rooms. They bought a lot of stuff. But every year during that oil boom, Iran generated only about 14,000 jobs. They could see their young people strive to go to universities mainly as a holding tank, not to get skills, but to be away from the streets. Unemployment soared. And when JCPOA came, they were looking to see Europe, United States address unemployment in Iran. One of the significant things that has happened in the last 2 years, and unfortunately, IMF, World Bank data don't reflect, is that the non-oil GDP, which is the level of economic activity inside Iran by 25 million Iranians who work every day, has remained basically constant since maximum pressure. Oil has dropped, and that is why IMF and the World Bank, who have models which give oil a big role, they predict output drops. The output drop that IMF predicted of 9.5% was in a year that the non-oil GDP dropped by less than 1%. And last year, the central bank says non-oil GDP increased by 1%, and the statistical center says it stayed about the same. The point is that there are Iranians who look at these data and say, well, we don't really need that kind of JCPOA, which generates a lot of oil income, and then we all spend it on travel and going abroad. And I think the reason why there is hope here is because these last 2 years may have convinced the stayers among the modernizers to respect the view of a lot of principalists, conservatives, who see a version of the resistance economy that you point in your article, and I think is very important to pay attention to. To me, resistance economy means jobs versus travel abroad, something like that, versus imports. And there is no good definition of it. Everybody has something in mind. Ayatollah Khamenei has his own version. I don't know if he's been able to articulate it very well. But I know that inside that resistance economy, there is trade, but trade is as technology transfer, trade as ability to export. And there is also privatization. Ayatollah Khamenei recognizes how corruption is so closely intertwined with public activity, with public ownership. So given those things, I think what needs to happen is a recognition that as we move forward, Iranians are looking to globalization, to interaction with the West as a way of getting their children employment. And oil doesn't do that. And it's quite likely that if, for example, Saudi Arabia is very concerned about Iran bringing 2 million barrels of oil per day to the market and ruining everything for everybody, that Iran could say, okay, if you don't like the oil, us to export oil, we can keep that to a minimum, accept a ceiling for that. But remove financial sanctions. That is the most important limit to employment in Iran. Rial is very cheap. Iranian labor is one of the cheapest in the world now. They're cheaper than China. If Iranian could export and bring the money back in dollars without much ado, using the global financial system, even a limited one, like you point out, Instex, that could spur jobs. And that could be the beginning of a look at the outside world as a solver of Iran's problem, as opposed to someone who wants to come and exploit them, take their oil away. This is old memory that hasn't gone out very easily. So the principalists are quite aware that Iran's professional class is middle class, and among many of them are stayer modernizers. And I think it would take some clever politicians to bring these two groups together. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago where I praised the Iran's professional class in health sector and how COVID may have convinced a lot of the conservatives, including IRGC, who came up with that ridiculous virus detector, right? To have respect for the professionals and then find a way to give them political space. And JCPOA or any renegotiation that recognizes this complexity that you have so well laid out in your paper can move us forward. Iranians look to Europe as a model, or the modernizer stayers look to Europe as a model of how Iran should develop. They don't look to the United States, because the United States is a very confusing entity. It is an imperialist country. It's the leader of the liberal order, but at the same time, it is a bully, like in the person of Trump and Pompeo.
Thank you very much, Djavad. And one of the things that I found most interesting in the course of my research for this paper was how even economists within the modernizer camp, as you mentioned, are understanding and gravitating towards some components of the resilient economy model. For example, in terms of the importance of trade within Iran's immediate neighborhood, as being a matter of necessity currently, given the trade links much more globally have been severed as a consequence of US sanctions. And another point being that, in a world where oil prices are now much lower than they were in 2012, 2013, the last round when the US and Iran engaged in direct negotiations, the question of what will US sanctions easing give us as an immediate cash injection is I think, a question that economists in the modernizer camp are also grappling with as they try to convince the domestic political elite to move towards some sort of a diplomatic track with Iran. I wanted to turn to some of the questions we're getting from our audience, and I do welcome all those who have some questions to begin to pitch them as well. Mohsen, this question is for you, which is regarding that second phase of the Islamic revolution that you outlined. And it's about how sustainable this strategy is for the principalists and securocrats, and how reversible it might be, given that the majority of Iranians have shown, according to this question, in one election after another, that they prefer a much more open and less ideological path forward for the country. So Mohsen, over to you.
I think the reason why Ayatollah Khamenei changed course, and the reason why he endorsed this significant power shift, was in a way in reaction to the threat perception he felt from the United States. Yes, the question of his succession was important, as I said, but perhaps the most significant factor, the most significant impetus behind this important decision was that he had concluded that after the US had gotten out of the nuclear deal, he cannot trust the United States. And in international relations, we have laws, international laws, but there is also traditions, trust. These are important factors. And when trust breaks down, people begin to take offensive measures. So in many ways, what we are seeing today is a reaction by Ayatollah Khamenei, whose job is to protect the entire Islamic Republic of Iran, not just the Islamic component, not just the Republican component, but the entire system, or what we call Nizam. And as that threat perception changes, I think you're going to see that that power shift could be reversed. What is important to remember is that the course Iran is on right now, domestically and internationally, is not sustainable. This idea of no war and no negotiation is not sustainable. Iran has to come to some sort of agreement with the West about its nuclear program and with the United States. The late Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani writes in his memoir that he kept telling Ayatollah Khomeini that before you die, please somehow try to normalize relations with the United States. That was about 35 years ago. Nothing has changed. So that idea of no war, no negotiation is not sustainable politically, is not sustainable economically. Secondly, what we have seen in the past few years is the continuous shrinking of the Iranian coalition, the coalition that brought down the monarchy in 1979. Now, as this power shift is taking place, this power elite is going to shrink further. And we cannot expect any one faction in Iran, be it the security-oriented section, the modernizers, the conservatives, they cannot alone govern Iran. Not only they don't have the expertise, but most importantly, the society we have in Iran today is a vibrant society. That society, that vibrant young population of Iran is not going to accept a shrinking part of the elite. They are going to push for opening up the political process. And if the Islamic Republic does not open up that political process, they will be making the same historical mistake that the Shah of Iran made 42 years ago. You cannot have economic development. You cannot have a prosperous society unless you open up the system. Now, in the case of Iran, when we're talking about opening up the system, I'm not talking about democratic opening up. All I'm saying, at least open it up so those people who participated in the broad coalition in 1979 to demolish the monarchy are back into the decision making. Therefore, having said all of this, I do not believe this idea of power shift is sustainable. And as soon as Iran and the United States go back to the negotiating table, and as soon as this perception of threat is lowered, I think you're going to see gradual shift to the old days of where there is some sort of balance among different sections. I don't think at this time, I do not see any possibility. Well, I see very little possibility of Iran and the United States negotiating. I think what happened to Qasem Soleimani, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, was a decisive moment in the history of Islamic Republic. They are unlikely to come to the negotiating table right now. What I believe is the most likely scenario is that they are going to keep open the doors of communication with the United States. They might even negotiate about some tactical issues, such as exchanging political prisoners or others. But then they're going to wait for the presidential election in November of this year. And if Donald Trump then wins re-election, I believe even then they are not going to rush into negotiations. They're going to wait for Iran's own presidential elections. And once they have elected a conservative president, and once the power elite is totally homogenized, then they might go back to a negotiating table. And if Joe Biden is elected, I believe he's going to return to negotiations with Iran in the framework of the nuclear deal. And I believe at that time, Iran would be ready to go back to the negotiating table so that they can address the fundamental problem they have, not having good relationship with the United States and with the West.
Thank you very much, Mohsen. There are a few questions coming in about this issue of what happens beyond November. Nasser, let me come to you. One of the features in the paper that we discuss is to unpack the concept of maslahat, which is pragmatic approaches towards problem solving as a fundamental feature of understanding decision-making in Iran. Now, I think in the paper, we basically gravitate towards the conclusion that there is space to apply maslahat by Iran's supreme leader, and Rouhani has some space in his final year of presidency to push the system towards some sort of a opening of a diplomatic process that can outlive his administration, whoever takes over on the Iranian presidency side. Do you see that space being present before Iran's elections if there is some flexibility from the United States? Or do you think President Rouhani is a lame duck president at this stage? Nasser, over to you.
Okay.
Nasser, you just have to. Yes, there we go.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, as you mentioned, this concept of maslaha or experience is extremely important, both politically and religiously or ideologically, because Shia in Shia Islam always clerics took pride that they never sacrificed the principle for expediency, and that was a part of basically that was a part of the dogma or the orthodoxy of the Shia. So some people argue, a number of my colleagues at Tehran University would argue that basically the most important contribution of Ayatollah Khomeini to Shia jurisprudence is the introduction of this concept of maslaha or expediency. And not only it is important for our fiqh or jurisprudence, it was enshrined in the constitution. Thus, politically, it is very important too. So expediency basically paved the way for the needs of the state. Because if you want to stick to the principles which was applied 14 centuries ago, that's almost impossible to rule. So although we have two sets of law in Shia Islam, the primary law and the secondary law, and secondary law was very much an emergency law. In other words, the secondary law always could be introduced in order to temporarily stop the application of the primary laws. But this maslaha gave a totally different meaning to that application. So it was extremely important for the government, for the whole state of Iran, for its survival, to have this what we call the concept of expediency, or this whole concept of expediency. Give you an example that, you know, it is very famous in Iran, that one of the clerics, which sits both in the Council of Guardians and also in the Expediency Council, he said that in the morning we go in the Council of Guardians, we say something is forbidden in Islam, and in the afternoon we go in the Expediency Councils and we say the same thing is allowed. So that's a contradiction which basically emerged between the primary laws of Islam and the idea of the idea of expediency, which is a necessity for the nizam, for the survival of the nizam. So that's about the issue which you mentioned. But regarding that specific question for the next year, it is true that Rouhani is a lame dog president, but still, as I have been arguing for many years, that if there is going to be any sort of a deal with the West, with America particularly, I mean, it should be done by the modernizers, because that would give plausible deniability to a shrewd politician like Ayatollah Khamenei. So just look at, you know, right now he can distance himself relatively easily from JCPOA and criticize the others that, you know, I never trusted the Americans. And in fact, in this regard, I give him full right that, you know, he was right. America should have not been trusted the way we did. All of us put our credibility on the line in support of the deal. And unfortunately, what President Trump did was destroying the credibility of the modernizers' forces. But still, Ayatollah Khamenei is a very experienced politician. After being up there for 30 years, he knows it is important to have the plausible deniability. Thus, if he's going to have it, again, if he's going to sit with the Americans, I doubt it would be done by the principalists or securocrats, as you call one of them. So, because then there is not a plausible deniability for him. He should get all the credit or the blames for anything happens. So that's why I think, first, I will not be surprised to see that, you know, he would not be unsatisfied with the presidency of someone like Zarif. And number two, if there is going to be a deal between November and our presidential election, if it is being done again by Zarif or by Rouhani, because that would give him the plausible deniability which he seeks for. So I agree with Mohsen. Of course, I disagree with Mohsen regarding the negotiation. No longer the negotiation. Basically, with the U.S. that war, no negotiation or peace. In this time, at least, we can say that Iran tried the negotiation. Iran tried it, but it was the U.S. who withdraw from the JCPOA. So it is very difficult here for the reformers to call for another negotiation. Although there are some groups who would call, but still, you know, still that would be difficult. I will not rule that out, but that would be difficult to assume that the reformers are going to go for it. Thus, the possibility of securocrats or the principalists calling for the negotiation if they win the election is greater than Zarif be the president and to go for the negotiation. Of course, I'm not talking about Ayatollah Khamenei. Ayatollah Khamenei certainly would prefer someone like Zarif to do the negotiation, or Rouhani do the negotiation.
Nasser, let me pause you there. Thank you very much. And I think at some points you disagreed with Mohsen's analogy, and at other points you agreed with it.
Yes.
But there's the complexity of Iran's domestic politics. I have two final questions before we wrap up the discussion, so do bear with us. I'm going to go to Djavad first on an economic question, and then Nages on a regional question that's being posed by one of our attendees. Djavad, if indeed there is a feasibility to get a diplomatic track underway between the Europeans, the US, maybe the Europeans doing some of the bridging work, and Iran, what kind of first steps need to be put in place from an economic angle to give some assurances to Tehran that the US is indeed serious and capable of delivering economic dividends? In the paper, we look at the idea of having some sort of an interim agreement in place, fixed on the nuclear issue on Iran's side, but what sort of economic ideas would Iran be looking for as an immediate win to take home with them?
Yes, I think the first thing is Iran needs to get a feeling that this unilateral US sanctions is not going to stay or get tougher. I think if they get a sense that countries like China, Russia, European countries can deviate a bit from the US designs, they become hopeful and they would like to buy into an interim agreement. For example, if Instex was operationalized by putting, say, $15 billion worth of pre-purchase of Iranian oil, that could be 5 years horizon, and that Instex would be able to move money around without its officials becoming hostage to US sanctions. I think Iranians don't believe any of these right now are going to work until they get a sense that US hegemony over global economy is declining. And I think that's a good thing for the world, by the way. No one should want to live in a global world when one player can decide who is in the game and who is not in the game. And I think that it takes a clever imagination, just like JCPOA, because it has a lot of clever aspects to it, to find this interim agreement so that it's not called negotiation. It's not called sitting down with the US. It's not called capitulation. It is getting, for example, Instex beefed up so that it has money in it, and Iranians, ordinary Iranians, I mean, small producers, there are lots of small farmers who sell Bing cherry, for example, to Dubai. Agricultural exports of Iran was over $5 billion. For the first time, agriculture beat oil in exports. This year, it will do that. These people need to bring their money back. If they were able to play also in Instex, so it's not just for the big cats, I think that's going to be something that can be sold on the Iranian stage by Iranian politicians.
Thank you very much, Djavad. And that's one of the ideas actually we explore, is the role of Instex as a bridging mechanism. But in my own opinion, we are going to need some sort of a US green light for there to be enough political appetite in Europe to take that next step with Instex. Now, I guess let me come to you with a final big question on the regional security dynamic. That's one of the chapters in the paper where we're looking, actually, despite the various tactics and preferences on the regional picture, on the ballistic missiles program, the different camps in Iran seem to be coming together on a series of goals, primarily at the top being to push for a US withdrawal from its immediate neighborhood. Can you explain a little bit how, particularly within the IRGC, the thinking goes about US presence in the region, and whether that needs to be met with confrontation or taking the more political track that Rouhani seems to be taking at the moment? Because one of the things that some people are surprised by, thankfully, at the moment, is that we haven't seen another spike and uptick in confrontation between Iran and the US in places like Iraq in recent months. Would be grateful for your analysis on that. Nages, over to you.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, the IRGC is not a suicidal organization. It's not going to come out and try to instigate war with the United States. It's an organization that wants the Islamic Republic to stay intact, and therefore it will pursue and advocate for policies on a domestic level within the political elite to both continue conversations and dialogues and negotiations with different actors in the region and internationally, as well as, though, and I think that this is what's really important here, the IRGC learned, those who are at the head of the organization now learned about international politics through the battlefields of the 1980s, in which in the battlefields of the Iran-Iraq war is when they began to, in their own assessment, understand how the United States fights proxy warfare in the region. It began to understand through the development of the last 30, 40 years, and especially with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, they knew very well that it was no secret that for many American policymakers, they wanted to put Iran on the next, as the next country that they would sort of go into. And so because of that, so many of the things that we see in the region today from Iran's point of view is an insurance policy. One of the reasons in which, and I think in the past 2 years, this has borne out even for those who may have been critical within the establishment of the Islamic Republic about some of the actions that, especially in certain places that were taking place from Iran's perspective in the region. It's proven, they've been able to prove, even those who were doubting within the system, that these sorts of tactics have prevented Iran from facing any other dire consequences from the U.S., whether it be direct attacks or any other anything else that could flare up the confrontation between Iran and the U.S. And so because of that, well, first, I think it's also really important to note here that many of these sorts of foreign policies, they're not a radical shift from the Shah's time, actually. Iran has had a role within the region, and especially with its neighboring countries for a very long time, whether that's seen as a role that is aggressive or not. And so in this particular moment, and especially from 2003 onwards, Iran and the IRGC have shown that if they are not involved in the ways that they are and are not creating those alliances with groups in the region in the ways that they have been, it becomes much more feasible that Iran is defenseless in the face of the US. And so I think especially the actions of the past 2 years have solidified in some ways, and this is one area where we are really seeing a solidification of viewpoints within the political establishment in Iran, that these sorts of regional role that the IRGC and Iran is playing in the region is actually keeping Iran safe from further provocation from the side of the United States. So I think that that's something that going forward will remain.
Thank you very much, Nargis. And I think one of the fascinating things that I found looking at the regional security debate was on the issue of Iran's missile program, and how under the last few years of maximum pressure, as external threats have increased from the United States, but this perceived alignment between Israel and Saudi Arabia as immediate regional enemies, that debate inside Iran about the extent to which they should develop the missile program or not has really diminished to zero, at least in the open debate that they're having. And the missiles are really seen as the kind of last tool for defense and deterrence in Iran, which obviously complicates quite significantly European and US efforts to find some sort of diplomatic solution to contain the perceived threat of Iran's missiles. Let me try and draw this debate to a conclusion. We're running over time. I'm sorry I know there were some outstanding questions that were being filtered to us. I think there's going to be a lot more flashpoints, unfortunately, on Iran in the coming months, particularly with this ongoing debate about the UN arms embargo and the US threat to snap back sanctions. And we may really see this internal discourse in Iran that we've seen harden and shift towards the principalists and securocrats, in my view, come out with a very hardened response to a US move to snap back UN sanctions against Iran, which is, of course, one of the last remaining benefits from the JCPOA for the Rouhani administration. So I'm sure we will continue these conversations going into September and in advance of the US elections. I welcome you all to continue engaging ECFR, read and do share our paper on Iran. I want to thank all of the professors on the panel for their deep engagement and rich comments and review of this paper and their helpful comments towards this paper as well. And I also want to thank my colleagues Kelly Lidovich and Kelly Patillo for their help bringing this meeting together. So I wish you all good health and good day and look forward to engaging with you soon. All the best. Take care.